Given the choice, whether to rule a corrupt and failing empire, or to challenge the fates for another throw, a better throw against one's destiny, what was a king to do? But does one ever truly have a choice? One can only match, move by move, the machinations of fate, and thus defy the tyrannous stars.
As the classical masters, such as Donatello and probably more famously Da Vinci, started to leave behind unfinished works, people started to become more and more enamored with the raw expression of unfinished or unpolished artwork. Eventually, this led to a trend of artists purposely leaving artwork unfinished, loosely referred to as non-finito, which translated into English literally means not finished. People's obsession with unfinished pieces of art tends to stem from the idea of getting closer to the artist, as it lets you see behind the curtain somewhat, creating a place of shared knowledge between you and the creator about the process that they use to manifest their work. Some good examples of unfinished art include the Adoration of the Magi, Franz Schubert's Symphony No. 8, and it's what's going to happen to Game of Thrones if George doesn't swap out the fork for a pen and get the head down. So in this final episode on the Legacy of Kain series, we're going to explore the final piece of this unfinished work, tracing back its ties to previous games in the series, as well as speculating on what could have been. Welcome to this very special episode of the Steam Pilgrimage as we discuss the Legacy of Kain. If you want to watch all of the episodes before this one, there's a link to the entire playlist down below. And if you really like this video and you want to follow the channel, maybe consider subscribing and turning on the bell notifications to be notified whenever there's a new video out. Also, you can join the new Discord server where there is a dedicated Legacy of Kain channel to go and nerd out about the series. If you feel like airing all of your grievances about everything that I'm probably going to miss or get dead wrong in this video, then I'll be there to receive your abuse. And finally, before we get into the meat of this video, please know that there will be casual spoilers for every entry in the series so far. Defiance was released just over 2 years after Soul Reaver 2, and about a year and a half after Blood Omen 2, so to say that these games were being rushed out is an understatement. The game takes place directly after the events of Soul Reaver 2, but the effects of the latest shift to the timelines can still be felt. For the first time, you control both Kain and Raziel in separate points along the fourth and final known timeline, with Kain still in the time of Janos Audron's death, 500 years before the Pillar's collapse, and Raziel acting roughly during the time of Kain's initial slaughtering of the Nine Guardians. Both characters have to piece together the mystery at play from their own perspectives, and this is the first time that both characters are equally as informed or uninformed of what's truly going on, exploring similar locations at different periods of time. But before we start to pick through the different aspects of this game's narrative, we first have to talk about how it plays in comparison to the other games in the series. If you're just here for the narrative discussion, you can check out the timestamps in the description and skip to whichever part catches your fancy. My analytics be damned.
The mighty Kain, scion of balance, would-be savior of Nosgoth, surrenders before the final battle even begins!
Very well. If this will make you see reason.
It seems like with every entry in the series, the gameplay takes both a step forward and backwards, introducing bold new ideas and then discarding the impact of these ideas with questionable design choices. The problem is never really that the games don't work, it's just that what the devs were going for is too often not thought through or tested properly for how fun the systems are. The original Blood Omen was an engaging romp through the world of Nosgoth, but the power-ups you would eventually come by would break the game and lead to the latter half being a complete breeze. Soul Reaver made the leap into 3D and brought about one of the most innovative systems in the form of the shifting mechanics. But the combat suffered greatly, becoming mainly a mild annoyance halting your progress, rather than a facet of the game that you wanted to engage with. Soul Reaver 2 added in new puzzle mechanics, but an overall lack of polish, as well as most of the features being cut content, made the game feel like a short continuation from Soul Reaver 1, rather than a big step forward. And finally, Blood Omen 2 got made. Okay, I guess they don't all have good qualities, but you get what I mean. Following this trend, Defiance fixes one of the main problems that has plagued the series for a long time: the combat system. Combat in this game is silky smooth, with your character snapping to whichever poor enemy happens to be in the direction you're moving while pressing the attack button. Instead of a lock-on system, you now enter a battle mode, with the camera pulling right back to show at least the most dangerous and closest enemies on screen at all times. You now have a bunch of new ways to deal with your foes, including a very powerful telekinesis move, which you can use to throw enemies onto spikes, and the ability to air juggle. The game almost plays like a proto-Arkham style fighting system, with you jumping back and forth between enemies, trying to interrupt their attacks, and dodging when necessary. This new camera system works perfectly for the combat sections. But the downside to this is that these fixed camera angles are present throughout the entire game. You can now only move the camera from its fixed position, which makes platforming sections an absolute nightmare, as the camera is almost always at an angle that makes it difficult to judge either the height or the depth of the jump. It's also used in a very obtuse way to hide power-ups and collectibles, with many of them being hidden literally just out of view in the corners of rooms. Using the finicky camera system in this way to hide collectibles kind of pulled me out of the experience, as it reminded me that I'm playing a game. If Kain was in this room, he could see this collectible, no problem, but I have to pan the camera manually to find it, and it didn't do much to help immersion. If all of this is starting to sound kind of familiar, it's because this system seems to be completely ripped off from the original Devil May Cry. The fixed camera angles and the multi-enemy arenas that have to be cleared before the door will open is almost a complete replica of the original Devil May Cry's gameplay mechanics. The structure of play is also very similar. The game is somewhat split up into levels, as you'll play a chunk as one character before swapping back to the next. But these levels, and sometimes several levels in a row, will take place in a single area, with backtracking and shortcuts opening up when you activate certain switches or you find keys to open doors. You'll have to keep an eye out for the emblems and symbols and remember where you found these later on when it's time to backtrack with the required item in tow. And if you think I'm exaggerating the similarities between the two games, here's Kain's version of High Time, and here's Raziel performing Dante's signature stinger move. Defiance is the first game where you can control both Kain and Raziel, and it's slightly disappointing how similar both of these characters control, with very few differences in the way that they interact with the world. As far as the fighting goes, the two have an almost identical moveset, but their animations are varied enough that they feel distinct to play. Kain is an upright duelist who relies on his ability to take the form of mist to dodge his enemies, while Raziel is as slinky and nimble as ever, and instead acrobatics his way around the place, flipping and weaving through attacks. But the moves that you start with, as well as the moves that you unlock later on, are the same for both characters, at least in function. They'll both learn quick strikes and air juggles, and Raziel even develops Kain's telekinesis towards the end of the game. The main differences are the Reaver powers that you unlock as you progress. Both protagonists find forges or relics to upgrade their respective versions of the blade, and through fighting enemies without taking hits themselves, can fill up their blood or soul meter. Once it's full, you just hold the attack button until you unleash your ultimate move, which for Raziel is usually some kind of an elemental effect depending on your currently equipped Reaver, and for Kain it's usually some kind of dimension bending effect like slowing time or teleportation. When it comes to exploration, the main difference between the two is Raziel's ability to enter the spirit realm. The same environmental distortions occur as in previous games when shifting to a different plane, and Raziel has to be in a spectral realm to pass through certain barriers, a feat that Kain can accomplish using his mist form. Instead of simply finding a conduit to the material realm, Raziel now has to find a body to inhabit to return to the land of the living. This is functionally the same as before, but I did think it was a cool explanation for how he's still able to shift back even though Daddy's squid face is mad at him right now. The Reaver puzzles have been dumbed down slightly, as you can now just switch Reavers at will instead of having to juggle them through the use of fountains, but the shifting mechanic is still used in some interesting ways. Problem with this is that it leaves Kain's sections feeling a bit stale in comparison. His special ability is the telekinesis that he learned from the Seer in Blood Omen 2. You use this to make paths for yourself by breaking rubble, but it's not nearly as fun or imaginative as Raziel's shift. And yet, the gravitas that Kain has as a character, and the weighty feeling of his animations still made me look forward to his sections the most. Maybe just because it's nice to see them breathe some unlife back into his character after Blood Omen 2. So the gameplay for Defiance is a bit of a mixed bag, but if you've been following this series, you'll notice that this is sort of a trend with these games. But for me at least, Defiance has the best gameplay in the series for one simple reason, and it's the combat. The controls are responsive and tight, and even if the combat system is derivative, at least it's ripping off the best in the business. I just don't get the decision to keep so much focus on the platforming sections if they were going to introduce this fixed camera system. Surely a hybrid between the two would have been easy to design, with the camera just sticking to your character's back during exploration, and then when you press the combat button, the camera would pull back and fix it to a certain point while you fight. Almost all of the combat takes place in these set arenas, so it wouldn't have been hard to just give each of these arenas a set point for the camera to hang out while you're fighting. But as it stands, the responsiveness of the controls does make up for the mild annoyance, if only for the simple fact that my heart no longer sinks every time I'm forced into combat, unlike pretty much every other game in the series. Fighting felt fun and necessary 90% of the time, instead of just being the barrier to my next bit of lore.
In their defeat, the vampires' enemy retaliated with a terrible curse, afflicting the vampires with a bloodthirst that turned their once noble race into ravenous predators. This curse plunged the vampires into despair and apparently drove many to madness and self-annihilation. What was it that so devastated them that they were driven to suicide?
Man, the PS2 was probably the best console ever released in terms of sheer improvement over its predecessors. It went from the blocky polygons of the PS1 era all the way to the sheer beauty of something like Final Fantasy X with its gorgeous pre-rendered cutscenes and in-game graphics. And Defiance is a game that shows off the true technical marvel that was the PS2. And while I'm fully aware that I'm now playing the game on a PC at 1080p and 60 frames per second, the game is still very, very impressive looking. The texture work, the character modeling, and the vistas that you can catch as you peer off at your next destination all have levels of detail that really should not have been allowed at the time. I also found the game to run incredibly well compared to the others in the series. The straight out of the box Steam version ran smoothly with no crashes or weird bugs, and the re-WASD configuration that I downloaded for the game worked perfectly. But even more impressive than the graphical fidelity was the attention to detail paid to make sure that the art styles were consistent across every game in the series. This is something that fans of the entire series will appreciate, especially if, like me, you're playing the games back to back. The first area of the game, the Sarafin Stronghold, is instantly familiar from the stone walls and the banners, even including some of the geometry from your visit in Soul Reaver 2. But the new areas that they add all feel like they piece together naturally. The same goes for somewhere like Vorador's Mansion. Man, the last time we were here was back in the two-dimensional world of Blood Omen, and yet the creators have nailed the feeling of this foreboding gothic mansion nestled away in the swamps of Nosgoth. And finally, the best part of any Legacy of Kain game, the voice acting is back in top form after the rather shaky and uninspired performances of Blood Omen 2. Simon Templeman's range as Kain is unmatched in the video game world, starting as a brash, headstrong young noble, corrupted by the madness of the Pillar Guardians, all the way to the contemplative, sorrowful and tortured rebel against destiny that he's become. His genuine care and love for Raziel is incredibly heartwarming, at times even putting Raziel's safety over his own mission. Kain's familial bond with his progeny shine through in the almost tender way that he tries to convince Raziel to finally start seeing him as an ally.
You must trust me, Raziel. Our intentions, for Nosgoth, for our futures, are not so diverse.
Michael Bell's Raziel returns as a truly tortured soul, beaten down by the inevitability of his fate. His delivery is brash and soaked in rage at his inability to predict and evade the schemes of those who would try to manipulate him. After 2 games, he's still in the dark about what's truly going on, leading him to doing some very foolish things, and you can feel the frustration driving his actions and choices.
I'm not who you think I am, nor is this a benevolent act. I have questions that apparently you alone can answer.
Richard Doyle and Tony Jay do a great job of playing the smug villains of the piece in the forms of Mobius the Time Streamer and the Elder God respectively. You can hear the tinge of desperation in their voices as they try to sell the idea that they have everything under control, even though they know that their plans are still subject to foiling for as long as the two Guardians are free to move around. They play a smaller part overall on screen, but the effects of their actions can be seen, giving them this omnipresent allure as antagonists. And finally, Paul Lukather and René Auberjonois, whose name I've just butchered, do a fine job in their supporting roles as Vorador and Janos Audrin. Vorador is currently in his pre-Blood Omen 2 days, and so he still has a bit of edge to him, seeing the world as a fruitless place as the vampire purges all but destroy his entire race around him. And Janos' desperation and confusion upon his resurrection, as well as the knowledge of his eventual doom in Blood Omen 2, gives his interactions a much needed emotional weight that I felt he was sorely missing in the other games. So now that we've talked about the game from a technical point of view, let's go and take a look at the unfinished masterpiece that is the story of Defiance and trace its impact all the way back through the other games in the series.
Raziel, you have been misled. You are ordained by prophecy to wield the Reaver.
And so I do, though not quite as you'd envisioned.
Redeemer and Destroyer.
I've always been a big fan of the time travel mechanics in the Legacy of Kain games. The deterministic way that the writers view the timeline allows them to add poignant, dramatic moments while keeping the main events intact and stopping the story from becoming overly convoluted. This can, however, make it difficult to remember which events are still relevant and have actually happened, so before we go into the story of Defiance, let's very quickly recap the events of the different timelines throughout the Legacy of Kain. The first timeline takes place during most of Blood Omen 1. This timeline includes the battle between the Hilden and the ancient vampires, the creation of the Pillars, the first vampire genocide, and the guardianship of the Pillars being taken over by the humans until Kain's rise. This timeline contains the blueprint for most of the big moments, and all of the timelines share these events. This changes at the moment Kain travels back in time to avoid dying to the Nemesis army during the Battle of the Last Stand. Kain meets a young William the Just, and as two incarnations of the Reaver meet each other, William is struck down some 50 years before that devastating battle could occur. This causes a temporal distortion and leads to the second vampire purges, which end with Vorador's death and drives Kain's ambition to take over all of Nosgoth. This second timeline encompasses the events of the canon ending of Blood Omen 1 and all of the events of Soul Reaver 1. Kain's empire, Raziel's death, and the return to the time before the Pillar's corruption all take place in this set of events. Notably missing is the rise of the Sarafan Lord and the defeat of Kain, which takes place in the time between Blood Omen and Soul Reaver, but hasn't happened in this series of events. Probably the longest lived timeline in the games, it does eventually change when Raziel overcomes his destiny by refusing to kill Kain in William's chamber during the events of Soul Reaver 2, triggering a third timeline to manifest. Finally, the last timeline comes about at the end of Soul Reaver 2, as Kain, who is now still present in the universe thanks to Raziel's refusal to kill him, intervenes at the moment Raziel is supposed to inhabit the Reaver. This is probably the most devastating to the timeline, as it essentially adds all of the events of Blood Omen 2 between the fall of the Pillars and Kain's empire rising. Raziel not entering the Reaver left it incomplete, weakening the seal on the Pillars and allowing the Hilden to escape their prison. But eventually the timeline reasserts itself, and with these events safely in Kain's past, but still around 700 years into the universe's future, we begin the game. Okay, are we all caught up? Good. Let's start with Kain's half of the story. The game has you skipping back and forth, but for ease plotting out the events, we'll take it one character at a time for now. We begin as Kain seeks out Mobius in the Sarafan stronghold, hoping that he has information about Raziel's whereabouts. While exploring the stronghold, he finds part of a talisman that seems to empower the Reaver with some special abilities. Kain eventually tracks down his prey, who seems to be talking to some unseen master. But before he can attack, Mobius incapacitates him with the same staff he used against Raziel's Wraithblade in Soul Reaver 2. As he leaves, he tells Kain that there are still things to uncover about his destiny. Eventually, in a tower at the top of the stronghold, Kain gets the jump, but Mobius simply mocks him by explaining that they both know that this is not where he's supposed to die. Instead, he directs Kain to an old vampire citadel off in the mountains. When Kain arrives, he finds a chamber that requires the entire Reaver talisman to open, which leads him to a number of inactive elemental forges. In these forges, murals tell of the ancient prophecy of both the vampire and Hilden champions rising up and fighting against each other. From what Kain can gather from the murals, he thinks himself to be the fated vampire champion. However, the murals depict two distinct outcomes and the overall winner is not clear from the prophecy. Once the talisman is complete, Kain is finally able to open the chamber and finds only a pool of water. The Elder God, speaking through this conduit, convinces Kain to enter a portal 500 years into the future, claiming that Raziel is currently in Avernus at the time of Kain's original conquest there. Meanwhile, 500 years later, Raziel is being held captive by the Elder God. Realizing that he is being used as a tool to help the parasitic creature, Raziel refuses to feed both him and his master. But the Elder God calls him out on his reluctance, claiming that his defiance is merely Raziel trying to escape his eventual fate as the Wraithblade. Emboldened by the taunts, he escapes the Elder God's lair and sets out to re-imbue the Reaver and find Vorador. Travelling to a number of elemental forges, Raziel finds more murals depicting the two champions and likens himself to the Hilden warrior as their flaming sword looks similar to the Spectral Reaver. He also finds the true curse laid upon the ancient vampires. The ancients were followers of the Elder God who believed that their souls would return to the wheel when they died. The war between them and the Hilden seems to have been one of religious dispute, with the Hilden possibly looking for ways to extend their lives unnaturally and therefore offend the vampire's god. When they were banished, the Hilden cursed the ancient vampires with a bloodthirst and sterility, but most importantly, everlasting life. This trifecta meant that the ancient vampires could never return to the wheel, had to feed on humans to survive, and had to turn others into the abominations that they had become if they wanted to reproduce. This led many of the ancient race to commit suicide rather than offend their god, and the vampires who remained were tasked with maintaining the pillars to keep the portal to the Hilden realm sealed, becoming the first guardians. When one died, they would kidnap a human and turn them into a vampire in order for them to become the next eternal keeper. However, constantly being kidnapped and fed upon, eventually the humans rebelled, led by Mobius and Mortanius, but with the Elder God ultimately pulling the strings. Soon, all of the Guardians apart from Janos were killed and guardianship of the pillars fell to mankind. Raziel eventually finds Vorador's mansion and, in a crypt in the back, finds the sadomasochist hidden with the body of Janos Audrin, looking pretty fresh 500 years after his death. He explains that if Raziel can find the Heart of Darkness in Avernus Cathedral and return it to Janos' body, the vampiric granddaddy will be restored to life. Travelling there, he finds a cult worshipping a strange, deformed vampire, who Raziel finds out is his final brother Tyrell, pulled back in time from the era of Soul Reaver. After defeating him and gaining the power of telekinesis, Raziel confronts the leader of the congregation, Mortanius. This event takes place just hours before Kain would discover and fight him at the Pillars in Blood Omen 1. Mortanius admits to his part in the original rebellion against the vampires, and claims to have resurrected Kain to atone for his mistakes, using the Heart of Darkness itself, which still resides in Kain's body. Before Raziel can get all the answers from him, Mortanius shows signs of possession by the Dark Entity, which you fight at the end of Blood Omen, and leaves for the Pillars. As he tries to leave the cathedral, Kain intercepts Raziel and repeats his warning from Soul Reaver 2 to not resurrect Janos. With their relationship and the weight of the constant manipulation coming to a boiling point, the two fight, with Kain gaining the upper hand momentarily. But in a moment of realization, Kain admits he doesn't actually know the location of the Heart of Darkness, which Raziel quickly fixes by tearing it from his chest and kicking him into a portal to the demon realm. With Kain seemingly dead, Raziel returns to revive Janos, and the two make their way to the vampire citadel. Janos tells Raziel to go to the Elder God's chamber, and there he finds a final Reaver forge. After a quick spat with the Elder God, he is able to give the Reaver its final enhancement, and at this moment, Ariel appears, telling Raziel that she and all the other Balance Guardians have joined to find a way to purify the Reaver. This purified Reaver must be wielded by the Scion of Balance, but all signs point to this being Kain and not Raziel. Upon returning to Janos, we see the moment of Kain's decision to not sacrifice himself as the pillars collapse far off in the distance. At this moment, it's revealed that the dark entity Kain fought was actually the Hilden Lord, and after his defeat and the pillars collapsing, he's able to summon enough strength to possess Yano's body. Raziel fights his former brethren, but can't bring himself to deliver the fatal blow. Taking advantage of his hesitation, the Hilden Lord strikes Raziel's physical body down, leaving to take Yano's vessel to fuel the device in Blood Omen 2, and forcing Raziel's spirit to return to the Elder God's chamber to be held captive once more. Over in the Demon Realm, Kain awakens with the worst case of heartburn ever conceived, but luckily for him, a big old portal to Nosgoth has just opened, and he heads back to the Vampire Citadel, hoping to find Raziel. With the path to the Elder God's chamber now open, Kain finds Mobius once again talking to some invisible entity, bragging about Kain's death. Even when stabbed, he tells Kain that he still cannot die, as his god will simply resurrect him. However, as he enters the spirit realm, he's met by Raziel, who stabs him with the Purified Reaver, allowing him to see his god for the first time, horrified at his deity's true nature. With the realization of how the Reaver works, and all the revelations he's made, Raziel realizes that he is in fact both the Hilden and Ancient Vampire Champion, an amalgamation of the two meant to aid the Scion of Balance to defeat the Elder God. Using Mobius' body to return to the physical world, he tricks Kain into stabbing him with the Reaver Blade. Raziel, finally accepting his fate, enters the blade and makes it whole, but at the same time imbues Kain's body with the Purified Reaver.
The Soul Reaver, pure of all corruption. This is what it is for. This is what I am for. The two become one. Both Soul Reavers together, and the Scion of Balance is healed. And I am not your enemy, not your destroyer. I am, as before, your right hand, your sword.
No, Raziel.
I'm not crying, you're crying. Now able to see and communicate with the Elder God, Kain confronts him, taunting that neither Kain nor Raziel can ever actually die. The Elder God responds by trying to bury Kain's body in the chamber, but Kain manages to escape. The game ends with him contemplating Raziel's sacrifice and thanking him for
The first bitter taste of that terrible illusion. Hope.
So now the story is primed for Kain's final rebellion against the Elder God, the manipulative parasite that seems to have orchestrated almost every event in Nosgoth's history since at least the Vampire Hilden War. A conclusion of epic proportions that we're never going to get to see. That's it, folks. Show's over. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Okay, that's not very productive. So what exactly do we know about the planned sequel to Defiance named Dark Prophecy? Thankfully, there's a lot of concept and interviews about the game that give us some insight into what could have been. From various interviews with different developers, mainly artists working on new concepts for the game, interestingly enough, it seems that Dark Prophecy would have involved Kain travelling to the Hilden Realm, possibly to save Janos Audron. The idea of having another dual protagonist story was also floated around, with older Kain helping his post-Blood Omen 2 self from the Demon Realm. Other bits of gossip and hearsay suggest Kain may have cut a swath through the main parts of his personal history, righting all the wrongs using his newfound free will to affect the timeline. There were talks of having Raziel appear in the sequel, possibly to give counsel as an apparition that Kain could speak to through the Soul Reaver. This idea was shot down, and probably for the best. Raziel, having finally accepted his fate, experiencing both the beginning of his imprisonment in the Reaver and watching his eventual release at some point in his future simultaneously, would have been ruined by his return. He fulfilled his role as both Redeemer and Destroyer and laid out the path for reconciling the two factions by embodying both of their champions. But that does leave us with an interesting concept. Kain now holds the Soul Reaver at the exact moment of its infusion with Raziel, meaning that theoretically he would have to travel back in time to make sure that the Reaver is present at all of the pivotal moments that he needs it to be in order for the timeline to work the way that he wants it to. This could have actually been a really interesting take for the final game, having Kain go back to the major events of Nosgoth's past and flipping the script, becoming the Great Manipulator and making sure that the timeline now bends to his will while keeping the main events intact. He could have used this to enact revenge, or stop himself from going mad and going through with the sacrifice. Or possibly he could have went far, far back to the original war and unite the Hilden and ancient vampires against the Elder God. This makes a lot of sense given Kain's title as the Scion of Balance. All of these different possible narrative threads though have been pulled from various interviews with different writers at different points in time, so there's no real way to know if any of this was written down or planned out from the beginning and which part of it is actually what would have happened had the sequel gotten a release. Apart from Dark Prophecy, another game was in development in 2010 called Dead Sun. The game was set to be a launch title for the PS4 but was cancelled about 2 years into development. Dead Sun seemed to be set in a distant future in Nosgoth, where the vampires have evolved to be a kind of vampire-wraith hybrid. After a strange occurrence, one of these new vampires named Kain kills a human named Asher and their souls become intertwined. Presumably these characters would serve as surrogates for Kain and Raziel, maybe following a destiny similar to theirs. The Elder God was heavily implied to have been the antagonist for the game, so maybe they would have finished the story by reflecting on the consequences of Kain's decisions after Defiance. From what little footage we do have, I can see the main complaint being that this is a Legacy of Kain branded game because everything about it reeks of that early 2010s edgy grit that pervaded the video game landscape for a time. The eloquence of the dialogue and the subtle symbolism seem to have been replaced with over-the-top violence and a propensity for the word fuck. The game also featured an open world design which could have been really cool with the addition of the shifting mechanics, but tonally this just doesn't seem like a Legacy of Kain entry. Eventually in 2013, the world would receive another game in the series in the form of Nosgoth. Originally the game was planned to be the multiplayer component to Dead Sun because, again, this was the early 2010s and every game had to have a multiplayer component. The game is set between Raziel's death and rebirth, with Kain now missing, having travelled through time in the Chronoplast, and the other vampire clans falling into a civil war. The humans use this time to rebel against their vampire masters and begin to fight back. The game was a simple team-based first-person shooter with one side playing as the vampires and the other as hunters in simple game modes like Team Deathmatch and King of the Hill. Unsurprisingly, the game was universally panned by fans of the Legacy of Kain series as being too much of a departure from the other game's narrative-driven focus, and as a cash grab using the Legacy of Kain franchise. And despite actually being free to play upon its release, never garnered much of a following. In June of 2016, the game was officially cancelled, with its servers being shut down and the game becoming basically unplayable after that. At this point, it's unlikely that we'll ever get a continuation of the main story, but one of the biggest enigmas that a sequel would have to tackle is the nature of the Elder God. He's been firmly set up as the big bad guy by now, but so much of his existence is shrouded in mystery. It's unlikely that he is actually a god, given his inability to kill both Kain and Raziel. So we have to ask the question, is the Wheel of Fate real? Time definitely seems to be a real force in the universe, with most people being unable to change fixed points in history, even having observed the outcome of such events. But under the Elder God's instruction, Mobius seems to have been able to manipulate events throughout history. This seems to imply that the Elder God can also affect the timeline in some way, as he is seen to have omnipresent knowledge throughout time. This is displayed when Raziel meets a younger version of the Elder God in Soul Reaver 2, who still seems to know who he is and what part of his personal timeline he's currently at. His eye, resembling the shape of an infinity symbol, is definitely no coincidence. The Elder God is often referred to as a parasite, with Raziel going as far as to say that he might be behind all of the strife in Nosgoth throughout time. And while there's certainly evidence to confirm this, it still doesn't hint at his origins. We don't know what happens to the spirits he consumes, and we don't know how souls come into being in the first place. If a soul is created when someone is born, then what would happen to those souls once the body dies if not eaten by the Elder God? Souls left to wander the underworld seem to degenerate, eventually becoming predators that feast off of weaker souls. So is this better than being eaten by the Elder God? No one knows what happens after you're consumed. Perhaps you really do return to the wheel, and the Elder God's maliciousness and deception are all just a means to a noble end. Or maybe it's both, with the Elder God's sadistic personality being separate from the fact that the nature of his existence is necessary for the world to work, and he's just personally kind of a dick. Unfortunately, we're never going to find out the answer to this question, so for now we have to treat him as simply being some sort of primordial Lovecraftian being beyond our comprehension. And maybe that's how it would have stayed had there been a sequel, but there's too many questions about the true role of the Elder God and about the way Nosgoth would function without him to simply leave this open to interpretation. Back in my Blood Omen 2 video, I said that the ending to that game is the closest we'll ever have to an ending for the series, and here's why I see it that way. Defiance ends at around the same time as the original Blood Omen, which means Blood Omen 2 is just around the corner. But we already know from having played that game that the Hilden Lord is defeated and the threat of the Hilden returning is closed. As time moves on like an unstoppable river, we can also assume that everything that happens after Blood Omen 2 happens almost identically, as time abhors a paradox, and will struggle to keep as many events intact as possible. So really, the Hilden threat that was the major looming problem associated with the fall of the Pillars has already kind of been fixed. The land still rots and the Elder God is still a problem, but the most immediate threat to Nosgoth will be taken care of as long as Kain doesn't mess things up again. So, is there a future for Nosgoth and the Legacy of Kain games? And what forms could it take? Obviously, the main problem as it stands right now is that the entire narrative takes place in a very particular medium, and converting it to something else, such as a TV series, would probably involve retelling everything that's already happened. This isn't a terrible idea, but the fear is that they would condense everything down too much in order to get to the new aspects of the story, and that the new parts wouldn't feel deserved as they rushed to get there. This could possibly be achieved in a more succinct way, in the form of a graphic novel, as the entire series could be recapped in a half a dozen issues, assuming the artist gave it the care and attention to detail to flesh out the characters and lore. The best way though to bring the entire series to a new generation would probably be in book form. The production for books is obviously a lot less than the other mediums, but this would require one of the writers, and by that I mean Amy Hennig, to sit down and write them, which she probably doesn't have the time to do right now. I think now the only way we'll get another game in the series is if there's a concerted effort to remake the original ones before releasing a new one, or we get a game like Dead Sun, which will be set in the universe but not a direct continuation. Neither of these options are really that appealing and probably wouldn't satisfy long-term fans of the series. If the games are remade, should this just be a remake of the graphics and gameplay, or a total restructuring of the entire series with different actors and abilities and a new way to tell the story? And would a spiritual sequel set in the same universe wrap up the story in a satisfying way while also being engaging on its own terms? It's truly a minefield, but my personal opinion is don't get your hopes up and instead enjoy the Legacy of Kain for its non-finito beauty. And with that, we come to the end of this 5-part series on the rise, fall, and tragedy of the Legacy of Kain games. I hope you enjoyed watching. I know a series like this means different things to different people. For some of you, this may have been your first look into this legendary game franchise, and others were probably furious at all of the things that I missed or misinterpreted. Either way, I'm just glad I got to talk about this series and keep the torch going even just a little bit. If, like me, you love to talk, theorize, and pontificate about games like this, you can join me on my Discord server. The link is down below, and for the next few weeks there's going to be a dedicated Legacy of Kain channel just for chatting about that game. I'd love to see you all there where we can talk more about the potential future for the series. Even as recently as last October, there were rumours of a PS5 entry into the Legacy of Kain series, but they don't seem to have come to much. For now, we just have to revel in the mystery of the unknown and live in that space of shared uncertainty that this unfinished piece of art has left on the video game industry. Join me next time as my sub count plummets as I lose all the people who were just around for the Legacy of Kain ride. Next time, we're going to be taking a quick break for levity's sake and talk about the worst reviewed game on the Steam pilgrimage. Until then, thank you so much for watching and keep hacking away at that backlog.